Welcome to Ned's Journal here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, and if you listen closely, you can hear a pet chicken. On Wednesdays this year, I've done a regular segment about the story of Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved serial killer mystery. I've talked about the Ripper since 2019 on the channel, but only an episode here and there. I talked about some of the theories in the case, and last year I did a three-part series about the letters in the Ripper mystery, the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. I have standalone episodes on all of these. And this year I really wanted the series to focus on the suspects, because now I believed it was time to begin discussing who Jack the Ripper could have been. But also, I am someone who is fascinated by the stories that surround these mysteries, and when I began looking at a suspect named James Maybrick, I learned early on that this was going to be three stories that are intertwined. The first is related to James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper. Was he the Ripper? The second is, was this just a mistake and it's not James Maybrick? It was his brother Michael Maybrick who was Jack the Ripper. And the third one is, who was responsible for James Maybrick's murder? Because, unlike many of the other suspects, James Maybrick was either murdered or killed in some type of accidental poisoning, and that is what I'm going to discuss very generally today. There will be a much larger episode coming out in the near future about James Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect, so you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these true crime discussions. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, Fridays an Anything Goes segment where any subject is fair game, and if you want to support any of these efforts, please hit the like button and subscribe, because that just helps out the channel. But you can also go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, there's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Because this is a shorter journal episode, I want to look at just the basic info that has been laid out publicly about James Maybrick. James Maybrick was born on October 25th of 1838, and he died on May 11th of 1889, and again, the Jack the Ripper crime ceased on November 9th of 1888. Anything after that is anybody's guess. There's some other crimes that may have been attributed to the Ripper, but they are unconfirmed. James Maybrick was a Liverpool cotton merchant, and after his death, his wife Florence Maybrick was convicted of murdering him in a sensational trial. This was known as the Egbert poisoning case, and it was widely reported on both sides of the Atlantic. When I was reading up on James Maybrick, I found myself immediately jumping over to different corners of YouTube, going from the articles to videos rather quickly, and that is because there is a documentary that is out called The Diary of Jack the Ripper, which has a strong connection to James Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but also there is an extended presentation on Jack the Ripper Tour, the YouTube channel talking about James Maybrick as a suspect, as well as the murder, as well as his own murder. And, firstly, James Maybrick is somebody, as a cotton merchant, who had connections to London. As it said, he's from Liverpool, but he had connections to London, as well as to the Americas. At even one point in his life, he's spending 6 months in America and 6 months in England. More than a century after his death, Maybrick was accused of being the notorious serial killer Jack the Ripper, owing to his own words in a diary, but critics countered that the diary and confession are a hoax. Forensic tests were inconclusive. In his book, They All Love Jack, writer and researcher and filmmaker Bruce Robinson produced an argument that it was his brother Michael Maybrick who was the true serial killer, and I'll be doing a future episode on that one, not coming out tomorrow, but in the near future, so as I said, you can subscribe, but I would definitely like to discuss Michael Maybrick as a Ripper suspect. A serial killer who became known as the Servant Girl Annihilator preyed during 1884 and 1885 upon the city of Austin, Texas, and there have also been attempts to link Maybrick to those murders. Now, this serial killer, the Servant Girl Annihilator, is one that I've talked about only briefly. The Servant Girl Annihilator is also referred to as the Midnight Assassin, and there's a book out on that subject by Skip Hollandsworth, and he's also done interviews in various parts of the internet, which I invite you guys to listen to. But the Servant Girl Annihilator was a very vicious serial killer, and even in one instance, they tried to use bloodhounds to track the killer's whereabouts, but there was just so much blood after a crime scene that the bloodhounds got confused. But that was a very pivotal moment in my understanding of true crime cases in the 1800s, and that is that once Jack the Ripper started operating in England, very early on, people began to think that this midnight assassin, this servant girl annihilator of 1884 and 1885 in Texas, could have been the Ripper. And again, there was an enormous amount of communication that was going on via newspapers, as well as just people sharing the story of Jack the Ripper. And I mean, people were very much aware of this, so there was a very heavy stream of news media that went around in the 1800s, and it's not like people in different parts of the world would have been in the dark. And another clear example of this would have been the murder of James Maybrick. As you heard previously, it was popular on both sides of the Atlantic. Maybrick was born in Liverpool, Merseyside at the time, in Lancashire, the son of William Maybrick, an engraver, and his wife Susanna. He was christened on November 12th of 1838 at St. Peter's Church in the city. He was named after a brother who had died the year before, and the Maybricks had him as the third son of seven. Now, when you watch movies and such, they always try to make it seem like a weird thing if somebody names their child after a child who has already been deceased, but perhaps there wasn't too much to nothing suspicious about that. James Maybrick's cotton trading business required him to travel regularly to the United States. In 1871, he settled in Norfolk, Virginia, and established a branch of his office. While there in 1874, he contracted malaria, which was treated with a medication containing arsenic. He became addicted to the drug for the rest of his life. In 1880, Maybrick returned to the company's offices in Britain. Sailing from New York City on March 12, 1880, he arrived in Liverpool 6 days later. During the journey, he was introduced to Florence, also known as Florrie. Florence Elizabeth Chandler, the daughter of a banker from Mobile, Alabama, and their relationship quickly blossomed. Despite the difference in age, he was 42 and she was 18, they began planning their wedding. And Florence Maybrick is ultimately going to become convicted for the murder of James Maybrick. Again, this is called the Egbert poisoning, and it was suggested that she poisoned him with arsenic. Now, when I was watching the episode on Jack the Ripper tour, it featured an author who had been exploring the subject from two different angles. One of them was from the Ripper angle, of course, but he also wanted to pay close attention to the fact that there are indeed two stories here. And that book is called The Maybrick Murder and Jack the Ripper, The Endgame by Christopher Jones and Daniel Dolgan. And the overall thesis was that this was a widely publicized crime, and that there still would have been an element of James Maybrick in true crime history prior to 1992 when this diary is discovered, and then this diary has all types of information that is leading people to think that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. And more or less, I've heard several different variants of the story in the documentary The Diary of Jack the Ripper, as well as in the claims that are made by the authors of the book, The Maybrick Murder, that electricians discovered the diary under floorboards when they were renovating the house owned by Maybrick, and then it went into the possession of somebody named Tony Devereaux, who then gave it to one of his drinking buddies named Cool Barrett, and then he went public with this in the early 90s, well over 100 years after the murder and crime spree that took place in 1888, which left the 5 women dead. So, I mean, there are so many questions that we would have in relation to that. I mean, was it authentic? Was it a forgery? Was it someone who was simply familiar with James Maybrick because he was such a highly known figure to the true crime world? Because, I mean, I will tell you firsthand, I've talked about similar stories here on Black Box Online Radio going back to the 1800s. I have episodes on the Basin Street murder, as well as on the curious case of Etienne Deschamps. He was a doctor from Louisiana who was involved in the trial of murdering one of his own patients named Juliet Deitch. Just because it's a lesser-known true crime case from 100 years ago, it does not mean that it would have been completely forgotten to everyone. So I could comprehend how somebody would use that as an opportunistic ploy to try and pass the Ripper crimes off on him. I mean, if it were indeed a forgery. But about the murder of James Maybrick, Maybrick's health deteriorated suddenly on the 27th of April, 1889, and he died 15 days later at his home in Eyckburth. He was buried at Anfield Cemetery, Liverpool. The circumstances of his death were deemed suspicious by his brothers, and an inquest held at a local hotel came to verdict that arsenic poisoning was most likely the cause, administered by persons unknown. But as previously stated, he was addicted to arsenic. Suspicion immediately fell on Florence, and she was arrested some days later. She stood trial at St. George's Hall, Liverpool, and after lengthy proceedings, the fairness of which was the subject of some debate in later years, she was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. The way the judge conducted the trial was questioned, and this may have been the reason her sentence was commuted to life in prison, some of which was served in prison Woking, Surrey, Woking, not working, and then the House of Detention at Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire. A re-examination of her case resulted in her release in 1904, and as it was shared on Jack the Ripper Tour, it wasn't exactly that it went through the Court of Appeals. They actually didn't have a Court of Appeals process at the time, and this was one of several cases that was influential in establishing a Court of Appeals and an appeal process, but the more or less the thesis of the presentation that was shared in relation to the book The Maybrick Murder was that she was wrongfully convicted. But paying attention to the language, being very careful when we're looking at the words, just because somebody is wrongfully convicted, it doesn't mean they actually did it or they didn't do it. It just means that there could have been insufficient evidence or that the judge at the time was senile. And let's get back to the post here. An episode of BBC TV's programs Murder, Mystery, and My Family was broadcast on July 27, 2020, investigated whether Florence Maybrick's conviction held credibility. When investigated by modern-day means, the investigation was undertaken by Jeremy Dean and Sasha Wass, and their findings were put before Crown Court Judge David Radford. From the investigations, it appeared that Mrs. Maybrick was subjected to the Victorian Morality Code by the judge and jury. The judge in the Maybrick trial delivered his summoning to the jury for 2 days. Modern experts assisted that Victorian society used arsenic as a beauty aid, and for someone like Mrs. Maybrick to extract a small amount of the poison from fly paper would have been commonplace. In addition, the arsenic found in James Maybrick's liver was 20 milligrams. A fatal dose would have been more likely 100 milligrams. So, it goes to show you that, firstly, he's already addicted to arsenic, and this is something that was used as some type of controversial remedy. Controversial in retrospect. Used as a remedy at the time. Now we would think it's somewhat of a ridiculous remedy. He was taking large amounts of the drugs, and only 2 of these drugs did not contain poison. As James Maybrick grew sicker, his brothers insisted that Florence be forbidden to access James. However, he grew yet sicker and died. A modern-day expert on Victorian society was consulted by the QCs and was asked whether the admission by way of a letter of a love affair between Mrs. Maybrick and an associate of Mr. Maybrick could have reflected in the judge's summing up, thus prejudicing the case. After the 2 QCs had informed the modern-day Judge David Radford of their findings with their expert advice, the Judge David Radford was left to consider the new evidence. Judge David Radford, having considered all of the evidence put forward by the QCs, said that the trial had presented a case against Mrs. Maybrick based on Victorian attitudes to sexual scandal, and in his 2 days summoning up the blindsided jury into driving a guilty verdict by undermining her character. Therefore, in Radford's opinion, the verdict was unsafe. But to be honest with you guys, I don't care about any of that stuff. What I think is much more important is, did she actually do it? Did she actually poison her husband? And what it appears is that just based on reading that very general statement, it appears that he did not actually take a fatal dose and that he had a combination of poisons in his system. I'm led to believe no, but again, I don't know 100%. This is just a very basic introduction to the subject. But the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because James Maybrick is one of the few Jack the Ripper suspects, and perhaps the only famous Jack the Ripper suspect, who was murdered almost shortly after the Whitechapel crimes ceased. And then there is the theory that James Maybrick was so distraught about his wife having an affair that he began to murder women as some type of revenge plot. But immediately, people on all sides were just asking the question, why would you murder other people in some type of revenge plot? Why not go after the wife or go after the person she's having the affair with? Those are more typically the individuals that would be targeted in a revenge plot. However, I have encountered this exact narrative in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and it relates to the Zodiac Killer suspect William Joseph Grant, who is the subject of the book The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up, also known as The Silence Badge by Lyndon Lafferty. And it's the same theory that Grant learned that his wife was having an affair with a judge nonetheless, and that he began to start murdering women and created the Zodiac Killer persona as a way to rebuild his shattered ego. To be very clear, Lyndon Lafferty does accuse William Joseph Grant of committing crimes before the Zodiac murders, but he attributed the Zodiac persona to that specific set of homicides to rebuild a shattered ego after his wife had an affair. And Lafferty accuses Grant of 41 murders, so there's a little bit of wild storytelling involved with that. And with the Maybrick case, I mean, if I had to bet my life on it now, I would say that there is a strong chance that Florence Maybrick did poison her husband, but there is also a stronger chance, I repeat, stronger chance, that she did not. One of those things where you're dealt with some type of conflicting instinct, but if I had to make an ultimate determination now, I would say no, she did not, and this was a result of deteriorating health from taking other types of drugs in connection with the arsenic. But that's just my take on the subject, and if you would like to respond in the comment section down below, feel free to do so. What do you think happened to James Maybrick? And please look out for some future episodes where I will be discussing James Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect, as well as the diary in question, and also looking at Michael Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect. So please feel free to share anything in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram, and I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.